In late summer 1988, an elderly man fishing on the shores of Norris Lake in Tennessee steered his boat into one of his usual coves one morning when the water had receded 14 feet, and he saw a straight line emerging from the mud. At first, he thought it was the remains of an old pier. Then he realized the line wasn't parallel to the shore, but ran like a path disappearing beneath the water. The stones weren't laid out haphazardly. They were bound together with mortar, and both edges were kept nearly the same width. It lay not on dry land, but hidden beneath the lake bed. The fisherman took a photo. A week later, the water level returned to normal, and the path vanished once more. If you want to follow the kinds of traces that surface for only a moment before the official record loses them again, like this video and subscribe now. Because sometimes the strongest evidence is what gets placed back under water the moment it appears. The official explanation was simple. Norris Lake was one of the major water projects of the Tennessee Valley Authority era, and dams had swallowed up old farm roads, stream beds, small crossings, and lakeside settlements. Not every stone line that emerged when the water receded needed to be considered a mystery. For an engineer, the answer was clear: an old road, an old pass, perhaps a simple rural connection used before the dam was built. But this official explanation faltered on one point, because there was no road recorded beneath that cove on land maps dating back to the 1920s, and the TVA's eminent domain files did not show a documented paved route passing through that same spot. That is why the Norris Lake story is more than just a story about a road. The real question is not whether the stones were there, because the photograph showed them. The question is why they were there, and why the official file was closed just as quickly as the water returned. If the road dates back to the known settlement period before the dam, it should have left a documented trace on the maps. If it is older, the lake did not merely cover the top of a valley. It might have covered another, hidden and unrecorded structure as well. The fisherman's name is not precisely established in local records. In some accounts, he is described as a retired mail carrier, and in others, as a former boat repairman who lived on the lake's shore. But the details describing the photograph remain the same: falling water, hardened mud, a straight line held in place by stones on both sides, and faint mortar still visible between the stones. According to the man, the visible section of the path could be traced for about 40 or 50 yards. Then the lake bed softened, and the stone line disappeared back beneath the mud. It was not a pile, not a wall, and not a water channel, but a regular passageway wide enough to walk on, briefly visible and then hidden again. This is where the significance of the first photograph lies, because a photograph alone does not prove a discovery, and old cameras can be deceptive when the lake bottom produces strange shapes. When mud, roots, stones, and old lumber come together, the human eye is prone to seeing order. But what's interesting about the photograph is not just the image itself, but where it was taken. According to the account, the negative was first shown to a local newspaper office, then to a land records office in the county. The newspaper considered publishing a brief note, but the records clerk suggested consulting old eminent domain maps, and this is where the second documented chapter begins. The newspaper note never developed into a major official story, and that is significant in itself. Local newspapers loved the oddities that emerged during low water levels: old gravestones, collapsed bridge piers, abandoned mill foundations. These were short, visual stories that readers could grasp immediately. But the Norris Lake photograph didn't quite fit into this category, because the name of what was visible wasn't clear. It couldn't be called a bridge pier, a house foundation, or a gravestone. If it were to be reported, an explanation would be needed, and for that explanation, a record was needed. Without that record, the story seemed destined to remain confined to the local newsroom. On a land survey map dating from the 1920s, there were old parcel lines drawn before the Norris Basin was submerged. The map showed main roads, stream crossings, farm boundaries, and some structures subject to eminent domain. But the cove the fisherman pointed to was empty, except, according to later accounts, for a faint note on the margin. Old trace? This phrase is not definitive, not a road name, and not an official symbol. It seems more like the mapmaker's indecision, as if he saw something but did not include it in the main body of the document. This kind of survey note carries a strange weight in investigations because it is not definitive proof, yet it is not entirely imaginary either. When a survey cartographer goes out into the field, they do not incorporate everything they see into the main symbol system. Sometimes they leave a line off to the side because they are unsure of it. Sometimes they mark a local's remark that there used to be a path here, but do not record it as an official road. Sometimes they leave a trail that's of no practical engineering use, marked with a small question mark for future verification. That is why the phrase "old trace" matters. It does not prove anything, but it does show that something was noticed, recorded, and then left unresolved. If this note really does mark the same spot, the story changes, because then the fisherman in 1988 did not see something completely new on the lake bottom. Half a century earlier, someone else had also stumbled upon the same line. One witness sees the rocks when the water recedes, and the other notices a vague trace on the land before the water rises. The two records do not recognize each other, and there is no direct connection between them, yet both recorded fragments point to the same gap. The third link is sought in the TVA files. Before the Norris Dam was completed, a great deal of official documentation was prepared regarding land acquisitions, the relocation of homes, the cutting of roads, and the status of bridges. In such large projects, not everything is recorded flawlessly. However, roads are usually documented because a road means access, eminent domain, cost, and future maintenance. From an engineering perspective, it is important to know where a passageway is located, which parcels it cuts through, and what will change once it is submerged. That is why the absence of a stone-paved, mortar-bound road in any of the main official files does not seem like a mere oversight. The language of expropriation files is usually cold and impersonal: house, barn, well, fence, road, bridge. Each is priced, and each becomes a line item. That's why the things left out of such files sometimes speak louder. If a farm road is going to be submerged, where it connects is important. If a bridge is going to be dismantled, its value is important. If there is a stone-paved passageway, it is expected to appear either as the property owner's right, the maintenance cost, or part of the documented transportation plan. If the line in Norris Cove does not appear anywhere under that specific name, it was either filed under the wrong name or was never entered into the system at all. When local researchers revisited this issue in the 1990s, the answer they received was often the same. There was no published field report for that location in the archives. There was no separate documented inventory of the stone alignment observed on the lakebed, nor was there any clear official record indicating that the photograph had been entered into the agency's files. This absence, from an official standpoint, closes the case. If a finding has not been documented, it is not considered scientifically verified. However, from an investigative standpoint, this missing record opens up a whole new avenue, because a physical path emerging from beneath the water in a reservoir basin is either recorded in the wrong place, mistaken for something else, or left outside the file that should have explained it. The next testimony comes from a family that grew up on the lake's southern shore. One of the family elders says he recalls people talking about a hidden route in the valley known as the Old Stony Passage before the dam was completed. This is not archaeological evidence, because memories fade and place names change. The path described by the elders may not be the same route the fisherman photographed. Still, the interesting aspect of the narrative is the repetition of the same word, pass. Not a road, but a pass. Not an ordinary rural route connecting one place to another, but a line stretching from one side of the valley to the other, as if following an older terrain. The second detail of the family narrative is even stranger. The old passage is said to be more visible during a drought than after rain. A normal dirt road becomes more distinct with rain. It leaves tracks in the mud, shows tire ruts, and the grass along its edges grows differently. But a stony path reveals itself when the water recedes or the ground dries out. And that detail strangely aligns with the 1988 photograph. The path seems to speak not of daily use, but of a hard layer that vanishes when covered. This small difference is significant because known farm roads typically connect to houses, fields, piers, or stream crossings. The stone path described by the fisherman, however, showed no such destination in its visible section. It did not lead to the shore, did not end at the foundation of a known old house, nor did it sit exactly on a natural shallows. Since the entire path was not visible even when the water had receded, it was impossible to speak with certainty, but the visible section did not fully align with the practical needs that existed before the dam was built. Then comes the engineering question. Why has the mortar-bound stone on the lakebed been preserved? If this were merely a rural road from the late 19th or early 20th century, it is possible that it was not dismantled before being submerged. However, the use of mortar, the straight edges, and its continuity beneath the mud set it apart from an ordinary trail. Local accounts mention that some of the road's stones are too neat. This testimony alone isn't particularly meaningful, since people often describe anything they can't explain as too neat. But if the photograph shows that the stones aren't randomly scattered, this statement now serves as a second piece of evidence. Another small piece of evidence comes from a measurement described by a former maintenance worker who worked along the lake shore. According to him, during low water periods, some old roads appeared not as a narrow line, but as scattered foundation fragments. The line at Norris Cove, however, was more orderly, as if its edge had been trimmed. This statement is not an engineering report, but it shows that someone familiar with the area could tell the difference between normal remains and an abnormal line. In investigations, this is sometimes the most important distinction, not the statement, "old things are turning up here," but rather, what turned up here didn't look like the others. When the water level rose again in the fall of 1988, the visible section of the road was submerged, which is natural because that is how reservoirs work. But according to the account, the rise was faster than expected. While those close to the fishermen thought that if they waited a few more days, a longer section might become visible, the water filled the area again. For the authorities, this is simply water level management. The drought ends, water is retained, and the system returns to normal. But for the observer, the timing is unsettling. The road emerges, a photograph is taken, survey maps are consulted, and then the water returns. The return of the water is not merely a visual conclusion, it also closes off the means of evidence. Samples cannot be taken from the stones. Mortar cannot be scraped away. The edgeline cannot be measured or documented. It is impossible to determine in which direction the road continues. The fisherman's photograph suddenly becomes the main subject. This is a convenient situation for the authorities, because the photograph can be interpreted, while the site is now inaccessible. At the same time, it is the worst-case scenario for the investigation, because the physical object implies its existence but cannot defend itself. It would be wrong to say that the story is settled at this point. On the contrary, this is where the greatest caution is required. Around Norris Lake, there are indeed old roads, old house foundations, and traces of settlements now submerged. Every time the water recedes, it reveals a part of the past. Therefore, it would be easy, but erroneous, to link every stone arrangement to an older world. The official explanation is compelling. People lived here before the dam. Some roads may have been inadequately recorded. Survey maps are not flawless. However, the official account must account for the fisherman's photograph, the vague survey note from the 1920s, the local memory of a rocky pass, and the gap in the unpublished field report. Viewed separately, each is weak. A photograph can be misleading. A note can be misread. A family account might belong to a different place. A report might never have been written. But when they all converge around the same cove, the story begins to look less like a rumor and more like a documented gap in the record. What makes the Norris Lake case even more interesting is that it is not an isolated example. In large water projects, particularly in the mid-20th century, valleys were not measured solely by displaced homes and cut-off roads. Sometimes the water also covered older surfaces. Local engineers' notes describe an unnatural passageway paved with neat stone blocks that was observed and briefly recorded along the Tennessee River during the 1925 drought. On other lake shores near the Kentucky-Alabama border, stone lines, mistaken for old roads during low water periods but not linked to any settlement plan, have been reported. Most of these never become major cases, because when the water returns, the problem recedes as well. The The purpose of these second cases is not to prove the existence of Norris Lake. On the contrary, they must be used with great caution. Every reservoir has its own history, every lake bed is different, but the pattern itself is the same. Water projects first survey the land, then they purchase the land, then they submerge the land underwater. If something goes unnoticed during the survey, and if it lacks the power to halt the project schedule, it is often jotted down in the margins. Once the dam is finished, that marginal survey note is now underwater. Thus, the reality on the ground becomes separated from the agency's timeline. This is where the pattern begins. The water recedes. A line appears. A local witness takes a photo or makes a note. A response is requested from an agency. The answer is often, it might be the old road. Then the water rises, the object disappears again, the file is closed. This by itself is not proof of a hidden world, but it shows how the record-keeping system works. What can be seen exists only when the water allows it. When the water returns, the agency no longer has an urgent reason to examine it. The greatest strength of the stone road at Norris Lake lies precisely in this transience. If the road were on land, it could be remeasured. Excavations could be conducted, samples taken from the stones, the mortar tested, and its direction plotted on a map. But a road on the lake bottom comes into and out of existence with the water level. The testimony of the person who saw it is even more fleeting than the agency's request for an official record. That is why the issue is not merely about what happened in the past. The issue concerns what has been permanently documented. Institutional silence reaches its peak at this point. The Tennessee Valley Authority's eminent domain files, dam projects, and watershed survey maps serve as the primary reference points for the region. Records from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and state water management agencies are also consulted for similar questions regarding water levels and field observations. However, according to the narrative, there is no published, independent, documented study accessible to the public regarding this stone road that emerged in 1988. The response to FOIA-style information requests is that no file could be located. This response is not a denial. But it is not a confirmation either. It is something even more dangerous, a gap in the record. There is no need to suggest that the agencies acted in bad faith regarding this gap. Sometimes the system simply leaves out what it cannot translate into its own language. An engineering agency manages water levels. An archive stores parcel files. A local office prioritizes old photographs. None of them may have made a major decision on their own. But the result is the same. The stone road remains submerged. The photograph remains in local memory. The map note remains ambiguous. The central official record, meanwhile, remains silent. If an institution says, "This is a forgery," at least there is a decision. If it says, "This is an old farm road," there is a classification. If it says, "We examined this, dated it, and linked it to the map," the matter may be closed. But when it says, "No record was found," a gap remains between the physical object and the official record. The story of Norris Lake lives in that gap. The existence of the stones relies on the photograph. The fate of the photograph relies on local memory. The map annotation is ambiguous. The agency file is silent. And the road is once again hidden beneath the water. This situation suggests a greater possibility. Perhaps there is only a forgotten rural road beneath Norris Lake. Or perhaps this road is the last visible remnant of a passageway older than the known settlement that existed before the dam. The second possibility has not been proven, but the documentation needed to rule it out entirely is also missing. If there is no map, no report, no tested sample, and the object is now underwater, the official explanation remains merely a recorded guess. Today, Norris Lake appears calm at its normal level. Boats pass through the same coves. Fishermen anchor along the same shores. Beneath the water lie the foundations of old houses, tree stumps, broken roads, and perhaps a stone wall whose true name no one remembers anymore. What was visible during the 14-foot drop may never reappear. Or, during the next drought, the same line might resurface from the mud. Then the question will be the same again. Was this merely a forgotten road from before the dam, or was it a passageway older than the records we've lost beneath the water? Because some things don't disappear, they're just covered by water. And sometimes, when a lake's level drops a few feet, a brief fissure opens in the smooth surface of official history. The stone road beneath Norris Lake is one of those cracks. Perhaps the explanation is simple, maybe not, but where the photograph, the vague note on the map, and the missing report stand side by side, the only thing that is certain is this: the road was once visible, then the water returned, and the file has yet to surface.